On March the 27th, 2008, at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a 14-year-old boy called Amro al-Badawi was stabbed in the neck in Queen's Park in northwest London. A few hours later, a couple of miles north, a 17-year-old boy called Devo Roach was stabbed through the heart and killed in similar circumstances. At the time, I was a candidate for the London Assembly elections, which were due to take place in the May of that year, and Amro al-Badawi was killed in my constituency. 2 weeks later, at their request, I visited his family in Queen's Park and saw for myself the devastation in the eyes of his father, having seen his eldest child murdered literally outside their homes. And it crystallized for me an issue which had been a big part of the then mayoral election campaign in the run-up to 2008, which was the growing sense, a sort of seething resentment in London at the time about the significant rise in serious violence on the streets, and in particular in teenage killings. It played a big part in Boris Johnson's victory and my victory in my seat in the May of that year, but it also placed a huge obligation on us to focus on that particular issue and do something about it in the years that followed. Sadly, 2008 saw too many young people join those two boys who were killed, Shakilas Townsend, Jimmy Mizzen, Arsima Dawit, and many others. The total in 2008 was 29 young people killed. It was the worst year for many years. But what followed was a shared mission between City Hall and the Metropolitan Police, and indeed local authorities in London, to get on top of that problem, successfully, to the extent that by the time we got to 2012 and the next mayoral election, the number had fallen from 29 to 8. 8 too many, but still a significant success in that period. And what I thought I'd talk to you about this morning is what I learnt during those 4 years, and then, sadly, given that we're facing a not dissimilar situation now, particularly in the capital, but across the whole country over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen serious violence and indeed murder spike upwards, what we're doing about it now. I guess I learnt in those 4 years broadly 6 things about the approach to serious violence, which happily for me now echo through some of the work that you were talking about, Lawrence, and indeed that others have done as well. The first was the importance of place. That violence almost always seemed to me, strangely, to be happening in the same places in London. Again and again and again, I found myself having conversations about the same boroughs, the same areas, and in fact often the same housing estates. That there was a kind of sharp geographic focus to violence, which indicated something to us about where our attention needed to be. And in particular also, we needed to treat the transport network as a place. That particularly in London, where there's obviously an extensive public transport network, but more widely across the country, the roads and the rail, that transport, in the same way that it was a channel for business and for all legitimate activity, was similarly an artery of crime. And that by concentrating on the transport network, you could have a significant impact and suppression effect on crime. The second thing I learned, and forgive me if this is all an amateur speaking to professionals, but hopefully it will illustrate to you some of the thinking behind our strategy now. The second thing I learned was about the psychology of deterrence on crime. That you can be smart about manipulating the psychology of a population that you're trying to get to, and raise the perception of the likelihood of getting caught, that being, as we know, the greatest deterrent to crime, that perception. And so, for example, some of the things that we did, I think almost really by accident, had a disproportionate impact. In Croydon, we worked out that every day, twice a day, between 30 and 40,000 kids would transit through Croydon town centre on their way to and from school or whatever other activity they were doing. It was a huge conglomeration. And that by doing high-profile operations in Croydon Town Centre at the right time, knife arches, wands, stop and search, yes, but just generally having a high police presence, we essentially had 30 or 40,000 advertisers for what we were doing, because young people talked, and the chatter amongst young people in South London would increase every time we did an operation and help to raise that perception of likelihood of being caught. The third thing I learned is that when we're doing sometimes quite difficult and challenging things around serious violence, and stop and search, as you've illustrated both of you neatly this morning, can be a very challenging thing to do, is political cover is absolutely key. And that making sure that there is political legitimacy behind the work that the police are doing in this very difficult area is absolutely critical. And nowhere is that more critical, I think, than on stop and search. Because of the sensitivity of stop and search, because of the history of it, if you like, and the impact of it felt across particular areas and particular communities because of its necessarily targeted nature, it's very important that the political leaders or the community leaders are alongside the operation. And certainly between 2008 and 12, both the Mayor and I spent many hours in meetings, large and small, putting our weight behind the need for that kind of assertive action tonight. The line always was, well, give us something else to do if it's not stop and search, but it has to be tonight, because we know the knives are out there tonight, they're in people's pockets, they're likely to be used. We need to remove them if we possibly can, and this is the best way that we can think of doing it. And we found that often in those meetings, while young people who'd been stopped and searched, often many times, were resentful, their parents weren't. And their parents were more accepting and could see the need, because of the victimization that you talked about, Lawrence, in particular communities, that there was a strong need for that kind of intervention, and in the end, grudging acceptance from the young people as well. But it was all based on the notion that that sort of tactic, in essence, needed to be temporary. Because, and this was the fourth thing I learned, was that there was a strong sense, intuitively from the community, but also now we know empirically and from an evidence point of view, that young people are on a journey to violence. That there are points in that journey where we can intervene, there are things that we can do to identify and prevent them from getting there in the first place, that will help with the long-term eradication of violence in a particular area or neighbourhood or community. And that too often our attempts to do that have been misaimed. We don't have a clear picture between public authorities, between the police and local authorities, about who we're dealing with. We don't necessarily always have a sense of what's going wrong in their lives. The trigger is sometimes too high for intervention. We wait until the damage is almost irreparable to them. And often our solutions, the things we do to them, are well-meaning but amateurish. They're not focused, they're not scientific, they're not therapeutic in a quasi-medical way, given that you're often dealing with deep psychological damage caused by broken attachments or whatever I think it's adverse childhood experiences is the jargon phrase these days. But something that's gone wrong in their lives. And too often we think that a bit of sport or a bit of music will sort it out. And it became clear to me during that time that not enough of those organizations were helping, very well-meaning and very committed to the work they're doing, had any evidence whatsoever to prove that it was working, other than the odd anecdote here and there about somebody they'd happened to help, valuable though that may be. The fifth thing I learned was that we had completely the wrong idea about gangs, or indeed perception about gangs. The first year or so that I was at the Metropolitan Police Authority, the Met didn't really want to talk about gangs at all, wouldn't accept that gangs were a particular issue in the capital. That all changed, of course, and it became clear that those semi-organized, possibly chaotic youth organizations, whatever they might be, we weren't clear about what their motivations were, we weren't clear about how they were driven or what their dynamics were, and so we weren't necessarily clear about how to eradicate them. And I have to say, one of the sad things for me about coming back into this world a couple of years ago, certainly in London, is that many of the names are the same. The names of the gangs that have given them guns, money, whatever it is, Mandem Killers, the London Fields Boys, all those gangs still exist, whatever, 10 years later, which seems an extraordinary thing to me, that their persistence, their permanence is sort of accepted, and we manage their behavior, not necessarily focusing on how they work, what they're for, what motivates the members in an attempt to try and eradicate them. And then the sixth thing I learned was the connection sometimes, I think, between poverty and violence, deprivation and violence, is the wrong way round. People blame the violence on the poverty rather than blaming the poverty on the violence. We learnt that as we got crime down in the capital over those, 8 years, I did it for 4, that the perception of the city as a whole changed. We had a great Olympics, foreign investment crashed over the city, and much of that was motivated by the fact that the city was safe, seemed to be the safest capital city in the world. And that is as true of a neighborhood and its prosperity and the opportunities that its residents have as it is of a city as a whole. The violence is as much a cause of the poverty as any other factors, and is not a product of it. There are lots of areas of the country which have high levels of deprivation, which aren't violent. And so the two don't necessarily, although they correlate, there isn't a causal factor there that way round. And so 2 years ago now, I found myself back in this job in policing, asked to try and do what I can to get on top of the issue, given that over the last 3 or 4 years we have seen a rise in serious violence across the country, driven by changes, we think, in the drugs market, the rise of the county lines model that you referred to earlier, David, that is causing so much violence, not just in the capital but elsewhere. And as a result, we've obviously seen a rise in the number of murders in the country, up from 500 and odd to over 700 at the peak, although happily now coming off. My predecessors obviously put in place a number of strategies to help with that and spent some money on what we call surge funding around policing. But what I've tried to do over the last couple of years is bring a bit of focus to the effort, bringing some of the lessons that I've learned and working, frankly, with some of the things I think that policing and the wider crime-fighting family has learned over the intervening decade, to look now, I think, broadly at 3 areas where we're going to concentrate. The first, as I say, is on this focus on place. Having a sharp geographic focus and understanding of what's going on in particular areas. And I helped in this by some accidental meetings. It's slightly alarming how many of these things are accidental. So kicking indoors in Essex a few months ago, came across Lewis Basford, who I think you're going to hear from later today, who talked about Operation Ark in Southend and his focus, having had, I think, come and studied here and taken and put it into practice. Some really startling results on sharp focus of geographic presence, if you like, hotspot policing, something which, as Alex Murray then led me on to Alex Murray's lecture, I think, for the Evidence-Based Policing Conference last year or the year before, given on a train, eye-catchingly, but nevertheless, where he talked about hotspot policing as well. And then that led me on to the work of Thomas Abt and his book Bleeding Out, which similarly talks about the value of hotspot policing. And in truth, what Alex Murray said in his lecture is correct, is that during certainly my time in policing, everybody's talked about hotspot policing. It's had different names. When I was at the Met Police Authority, it was cops on dots, they called it. There was obviously the behind neighbourhood policing was a sense of presence. We've had hotspot policing. We've now got Operation Ark. But in truth, I think we've never really done it properly, and it's never been a permanent part of policing, a sustained part of policing, where it shows real results. And so what we've done this year is take what was surge funding, call it GRIP funding, target it into the 18 forces with the highest levels of violence on a request that they focus very sharply on micro-violence hotspots along the model that was adopted in Southend, to show that when we are consistent and focused and we use the data properly, we can have an impact. That approach will be rolling out over the summer. Happily, it coincides with the release from COVID restrictions, which has had an impact on crime up and down. We saw a surge last August. I'm hopeful that that new tactic will help us get on top of a possible surge this summer. The second thing, we're obviously concentrating on drugs. I think the big difference over the last 10 years for me that I've seen has been the growth of drugs as a driver of violence. We had it then, of course, but it wasn't sitting behind quite so much of the violence, and particularly not amongst young people. This awful, pernicious, horrendous model of county lines where young people are often victimized and driven into activity which is incredibly violent. In my own constituency in Andover, a very low crime town, we had a horrible murder, neither victim nor perpetrator from Andover, come down to deal drugs and fight about the territory. Concentrating on county lines, driving those gangs out of the rural areas and the smaller towns, as well as suppressing violence generally at home, we think will have a big impact. And one of the key aspects of that, I think, and this links to what I said about us not understanding gangs and how they work, was what I asked at the start was for people to think differently about what a county line drugs gang was. And not necessarily to see it as a group of criminals, but to see it as a business. That this was an operation that was fundamentally being prosecuted to get money. And that if you saw it as a business, then interfering with that business led you towards a kind of different approach. The standard approach, of course, identify the whole gang from soup to nuts, the lot of them, then have a massive operation on one day where they're all taken out, they're all put in front of the court, all go to prison for a long time. It takes a long time and is very expensive. But when you think about it as a business, there are lots of things that business do that make them vulnerable, that we can intercept and use, frankly, to dismantle it. So their use of the transport network, as I said earlier, if we can grip the transport network, then we start to restrict their ability to distribute their product and indeed bring the money back. And the British Transport Police are doing a fantastic work now with a County Lines task force, which we've paid for. They're discovering all sorts of things about the transport network that they didn't know before. Got their first sniffer dogs for over a decade, which is doing great work. Similarly, the three big exporting forces, Liverpool, West Midlands, London, given money specifically to work up operations so that with importing forces, as soon as a gang appears in lovely Dorset, that they can work with the origins of that gang to take out particularly the high-quality controller of the line, make sure they get the person that's controlling the whole operation, because we want those individuals with unique skills rather than necessarily the people who are replaced at the front end quickly, that we can degrade that business as well. And that work is having an enormous impact. Norfolk, for example, who were first on the scene with the operation 16 months ago, had seen in the previous 3 years an enormous spike in horrendous violence in a county which was not used to it. They tried the standard criminal justice approach at their end of arresting the drugs mules who were perpetrating a lot of the violence, but only to see them replaced within half an hour. And it was having no impact on the violence whatsoever. If anything, it was driving it up. The moment they got involved in what's called Operation Orochi in London, which is where most of the gangs were coming from, they saw an immediate impact. And we're now at a situation where, having had over 100 lines into the county 16 months ago, they're now down to under 10, and hopefully soon to eradicate them as well. And we've seen similar results across the country. Kent have halved their number. We saw North Wales Police, after 20 years of drug dealing by Liverpool gangs in Bangor in North Wales, have now declared it county lines free. By a simple approach, a rethinking of the approach, and working together on that particular issue, we can drive it down and the violence with it. We've invested £65 million now in that programme. It's having a huge impact, and I hope to see more. And then the third area that we're going to concentrate on is obviously on people. We know, they talked about it as well in the past, there are hot people But we are able now, with the power of the data that we have, to identify pretty much in every county a kind of top list of both those who are likely to be perpetrators of violence or indeed victims, and often they are one and the same. The key thing is making sure we have a shared picture. And through the violence reduction units, which are now in their third year actually across the country, we are now demanding a much sharper focus on that shared picture of who we're dealing with and what other organisations can do to help us. That will be assisted by the new serious violence duty, which is coming in legislation later this autumn. It's in the bill that's going through at the moment, and that will demand that local authorities, health and others come alongside the police to assist in the fight. So the VRUs, 18 of them across the country, but I'm hopeful the model will be adopted elsewhere, will provide that data, that list, that sharp focus on individuals, which means that we can concentrate on them. In high harm, with high harm individuals, we're piloting now a thing called the Knife Crime Prevention Order in London. If that goes well over the next year, we can roll that out to the rest of the country, and that is an order that the police can apply for an individual who they believe either has been convicted of a knife crime or is they suspect of carrying a knife, and it's a negative and positive. They can't go to the town centre, they must go to this training centre. It can put those kind of obligations on people, and we're willing to try other innovations. But the identification of those individuals and making sure that all the partners that we need to intervene with them on this journey towards crime, I think are absolutely critical. I would recommend to you, as you do your work, that you pick up from time to time some of the very, very sad serious case reviews that happen after a young person is killed. Because they're A, incredibly sad and moving, but B, incredibly informative. And in particular, I would point you towards one that was written about the death of Jaden Moody, who was a young boy, a 14-year-old boy, stabbed by a group of older boys in London, in Leighton, in February 2019. And when you read the story of his life, you absolutely see the journey to where he was, to the extent that 3 months before he was killed, he was found in a drugs den in Bournemouth, having been missing from home for 3 days, and nobody had mentioned it. A 14-year-old boy, 2.5 hours from home for 3 days, nobody mentioned it, nobody would get it. When he was brought back, he was just brought back and let go, and that was it. 3 months later, he was dead. These are the kind of sad stories from which we must learn collectively, and where I hope the serious violence duty will sharpen the obligation of the social care authorities and health to help us. On top of that, obviously, we're doing quite a lot structurally to help with serious violence. Hopefully 20,000 new police officers will assist, and please remember that to get to 20,000 extra police officers, we've got to recruit about 45,000 in total. That means we're going to have an awful lot of police officers who will be in uniform, able to perform that sentinel duty, if you like, outside, in uniform, in the streets, helping to suppress violence, particularly in hotspots. And through the National Policing Board, we've set some national priorities, very much focused in this area, putting murder top of the tree, the suppression of murder, which we hope will mean that police forces need to reach back into the crime types that culminate in a murder, domestic violence, obviously drugs, gangs, guns, and young people, that culminate in a murder, to suppress that, as well as setting serious violence as a key indicator for the future. All of that now sits under a Crime and Justice Task Force, which is chaired by the Prime Minister. Should be no surprise that as a crime-fighting mayor, he now wants to be a crime-fighting PM, and I was there yesterday with him being challenged on exactly these issues. All of this, I hope, will come together, along with you and the very valuable work that you're doing today, into a scientific, evidence-based approach to dealing with violence. 10 years ago, I think it's fair to say that when we took on the violence in the capital, much of what we did was based on intuition. What's happened in the intervening decade is that we've acquired a huge amount more knowledge in terms of data, international comparisons. We've obviously got this program here in Cambridge, which is doing great work in pointing the way forwards. And we have a police force which is much more technology enabled than it used to be. 10 years ago, there was a lot of green screen around. Now you'll find police officers much more familiar with and motivated by and assisted by technology in a way we weren't before. And that will allow us, I think, over the next couple of years to get on top of some of these issues and drive it down. Final word from me, just before, and I'm happy to take some questions, is just a recommendation to all of you, which is that it's very important, I think, in all our work on violence, that we see the human beings at the other side. We often talk about statistics, and in a world of data, it's easy to do that. And one of the saddest things for me when I first got to City Hall was meeting senior officers at the Metropolitan Police and being told that in a city of 6.5 million people, having 10 or 12 teenagers stabbed and killed was statistically insignificant. Those are somebody's kids. Whatever you might think about them, whatever they might have done in their lives, somebody's children, brother, sister, right? We have to see the human being in all of these things. And if we do that, along with the skills and the tools that we now have in modern policing, then I think we can have a huge impact. Thank you very much indeed for having me today, Lawrence. It's fantastic, and I was very keen to come along and talk to you because this is one of the critical missions for us as a government, to get on top of the violence, which sadly has spiked, but which we know we can return to a downward trend, and it'll be great to work with all of you to get us there.
Police and Minister, thank you. Two questions, if I may. First one, just in relation to the violent crime duty. Do you think contained within that there may be some opportunity to share data better, particularly with the NHS, which seems to be a perennial issue within VRUs? And then secondly, Minister, slightly provocative question, and I might anticipate your answer, but just in relation to GRIP, the ability to be stable in the funding of that gives us greater opportunities to embed that and maintain that in the year-to-year funding presents an operational challenge to that. So just your views or comment on that, if I may, please, Minister.
Yeah, okay. So on your second point first, on the GRIP and the funding, I mean, look, what I'm trying to do with all the programs that we've started, the County Lines program, the GRIP funding, the various other bits and pieces, is effectively show success through what we're doing, to the extent that chiefs and police and crime commissioners see that success and decide to start investing in it themselves, right? Because while we're obviously in a challenging economic environment, post-COVID, all the rest of it, we have seen some great settlements for policing over the last 2 years. We're committed to the 20,000 police officers, and we've got another 8 or 9,000 to go in the third year. We're well ahead of schedule. We might get there early. Quite a lot of chiefs are recruiting ahead of schedule, which is fantastic. But as we move towards full capacity on cops, what I'm hoping is that success we see, for example, on hotspot policing, becomes exactly that, becomes kind of mainstreamed, part of the day-to-day business, that because we've got the greater police capacity, we've got our response is satisfied. Obviously, 999 has to be dealt with. We've got enough response. We've now got the capacity to do some other work. And we're seeing that in parts of the country already. So, for example, I was in Bromley with the Met, seeing their predatory offenders unit. And the predatory offenders unit is exactly a product of the extra capacity that they've got, that they can do other things. That is a unit which looks at individuals who have been violent towards their partners in domestic abuse and otherwise, but the partner's too frightened to take a prosecution or to give evidence, so they have a look at the individual to see if they can get them some other way. It's a really good unit, taking out some very nasty, violent individuals, but that's come about purely because of the extra capacity. So what I hope is exactly that this stuff will mainstream. County Lines, the hotspot GRIP funding, all of that will become business as usual. Frankly, I think as Alex Murray said in his this lecture, I would, if you haven't seen it, urge you to look it up. You'll know it's the one, it's on YouTube, because he gives it on a train. And it's exactly that. He says, look, we've tried hotspots, we do it for a bit, we've never done it on a sustained basis, it needs to be part of day-to-day business. So yes, I will keep up the capacity as long as I possibly can. And what I hope is that as the numbers fall, the key thing from my point of view is that when it works, and it will work, and the numbers fall, there will be a temptation to do something else. And it feels to me as if that's the mistake that was made between the end, the 2008-12 period and now, in that we all went off to do other things, and suddenly here we are back with knife crime and county lines on the rise. So embedding it as part of the warp and weft of policing is the mission. We'll fight about the money when we get there. On your first issue, I find myself wandering around the crime-fighting landscape, constantly astonished at the inability to share data, and thinking to myself, what would the British public think about this? I mean, we've had situations where the police and the Crown Prosecution Service can't share data around the prosecution of a criminal. I think people would think that was bonkers. And so part of my job is to find those lacunae, those breaks, those dams in the data, and try and put them all together, or try and overcome them. We're, in conversation with the ICO about some of these things, and we want to have a kind of proactive approach with them, where we go and say, look, here is some data that we can put together, which will give us a great result. Can we please? And we'll test that envelope as much as we possibly can. Having said that, we still have some basic areas where data is not fully shared, and it can be. So some areas are doing extremely well, for example, on violence, and particularly focused on young people. I was at Thames Valley Police a month or so ago. They've got a fantastic, best-in-class data sharing, real-time data sharing between local authorities and police around young people, which gives them their list of the top 874 individuals that they're concerned about in their county. There are some where I go and say, have you got a shared list? We're sort of getting there, right? So there's a lot for us to do as well before we get onto that more complicated stuff. But the serious violence duty will be, I think, a real game changer on this, because it will put the boot up local authorities and critically health to put all that data together, so they've got a shared picture, because they will have a duty as well. And it was most illustrated for me, that problem, where when I was at the police authority, and I hate talking about it, it feels like one of those like armchair generals who retired, but when I was there, we started to do these things called joint engagement meetings with every borough in London, where we would get the police, the local authority, the health service, the ambulance service to come together, to share their data. We'd do a big PowerPoint together. And what was amazing was that the ambulance hotspots for violence were completely different from the police hotspots for violence. That the two, there was some overlap, but broadly they were different. And their sense of problem premises was different from police sense of problem premises. So if we're going to have that sharp geographic focus, it's critical we have a shared picture, and we'll try and do that under the SV duty.
Good morning, Minister. Elisa Wilson from Lancashire Police. I think it's great that the government have put some money forward for looking at hotspots under the GRIP funding. I just wondered if there's any direction to police forces on how those hotspots are determined, whether it's crime count or crime harm?
Well, it's a good question, and to be honest with you, I think it's for you. I mean, one of the things we've asked for as part of the GRIP funding essentially is that the key characteristics of ARC, which you're going to hear about later, that they are adopted. That there is you've got your hotspots, your micro hotspots mapped, that you've got the idea that cops will visit them on a random basis, that there is a strong sense of presence there during the day, and that we see the results as they come through. But variations across the whole of policing, I think, is absolutely fine. One of the things we want to do in this first stage is kind of learn from different areas, and it will depend. So, your hotspot policing in parts of Lancashire will be different from London, because the geography is different, the built environment is different, the demographics are different. So I'm sort of relaxed about how you define it, as long as the violence numbers overall drop. I mean, my key indicator is injuries to admissions to hospital with a knife injury. That's the measure on which we're all being held, and if that, it's third party, so it's not for us to decide. If that number falls, which happily, thankfully, touch wood, it now is, then I'm content. But the critical thing that I want to see, and I think the team wants to see, is a sharp understanding of where they are. And one of the things that was very striking about the Southend evidence that I saw was that sometimes that was 200 yards of a particular street. It was that micro. And that by having a 15-minute-a-day presence on a random basis in that micro hotspot, they saw 70% falls in violence. Now, other people are getting there, sort of got there accidentally. So I saw the Boku commander in Hounslow in London at about the same time. Hounslow, amazingly, was the second most violent town centre in the capital. And he got into the job and decided that he wasn't having this anymore. And so he started hammering the street drug dealers in the town centre, in a sharp bit of the town centre. Similarly, 70% falls in violence in that particular part of London. Now, that is a sort of getting there by another means, right? He'd got his hotspot, he knew what it was, but it was drug-defined. He was hammering those people, and as a result, he saw violence drop. So it depends. But the key characteristics, from my point of view, need to be there. And the critical thing is sustain. Sustain, it's not a surge. It's not a blitz. We're not going for 2 or 3 months. We are sustaining it there day after day after day after day. And the critical thing, I think, from a sort of workforce management point of view is obviously, if you're a police officer, it's quite dull, actually. But the great thing about the ARC model is that it's not a huge infringement on your day. It's a kind of drop in for a short period. Park the car up somewhere quite high profile, walk around and say hello to people, make your presence felt, and then kind of get on with the rest of your day. And for me, that was quite, a good thing for a police force that wants to be hunters rather than sentinels. That's the exciting bit. The sentinel model is not that exciting, but in the right place at the right time, it can be incredibly effective.
How do we square the circle of many of our communities not believing that violent crime is key policing priority? They are more concerned, and they tend to be the white middle class, more concerned about antisocial behaviour, travellers. James talked about jumping off the top of, tombstoning, e-scooters. How do we ensure that we get the message across that there needs to be some form of priority? We need to get in early, and we need to prioritise with a significant amount of resources those crimes that lead to serious violence and hopefully prevent murder in the long run.
So it's a really great question, and I, like you, have sat in ward panel meetings where the biggest priorities that have been raised have been cycling on the pavement and dog mess. And I've said to them, you do know there was a murder like 5 streets away 3 weeks ago, kind of thing. And that's, and there is a discontinuity there, right? So people don't think it's about them until it actually happens outside their front door, and it's easy to be separated from it. I mean, in the end, to a certain extent, you have to have a mission that does both. I'm hesitant to have a list of priorities, each of which has a 1 in front of it. And it is quite tough to tell people that this crime is more important than that crime. Fundamentally, though, that's the job of your police and crime commissioner. And when I said that you need to use them, the local leaders, to buy the legitimacy about what you're doing, that's pretty critical. It is, however, possible, I think, to do both and to address the things that the British people think are most important. What I've talked about in the past is, alongside violence, which is one of them, I basically talked about the big 5 that we need to address. And as you know, the National Policing Board has got those 5 priorities: murder, serious violence and drugs, and then neighbourhood crime, burglary, robbery, car crime. And if it's sold as a package, then the people are, in my experience thus far, people are very accepting about that. But at the same time, they have expectations about antisocial behaviour in their area. They want to make sure that they can walk in the park without being molested by a group of teenagers who are jostling and behaving badly. And I hope that as we give you the extra capacity over the next 2 years or so, you'll be able to do both. But if it comes down to the choice, I think you just have to grit your teeth and go for violence.
I just wanted to ask your views on county lines and what we've heard a lot about this morning around travelling criminals and children that are being exploited to then go to other areas. And it strikes me we talk a lot about dealing with the symptom rather than the cause, and actually these children are often victims that are exploited in areas that are hotspots in themselves because of deprivation and lots of other reasons. Within that, clearly the police have got a role to play, but there's a wider partnership role to try to actually make those more hostile areas for recruiting the next group of counterline victims. So I wondered what your views were on the role of the police within that to get to the real root cause of it, and actually how we all work together as part of a partnership to address it.
Yeah, so look, I think there are two things. I mean, the first thing is from my point of view, police have to be focused on the exploiters. I keep saying to everybody, it's a bit like that Christmas cracker joke. How do you kill a circus? Go for the juggler, right? The key is that we know that there are people in each of those organizations who have unique skills, right? They're the people holding the phone, they are the people with the Rolodex, they are the people who know where to get the wholesale drugs. They're unique skills. And they are the people who are recruiting and exploiting the young people. So the first thing we can do, I think, from our point of view, is target them. And the great thing about Orochi and Toxic in Liverpool and in West Midlands is that is exactly what they're doing. They're targeting those guys. And then alongside that, obviously, there's the safeguarding. And I think we've safeguarded over 1,500 young people now as part of over the last 16 months, which is great news. But using the serious violence duty and the shared local picture to identify those young people who are most likely to get involved in this sort of activity, and then get local authorities and others to intervene with them earlier. The saddest thing, as I said, about the Jaden Moody issue, there he was, right, in county lines, in Bournemouth, been there for 3 days, in a drugs den. You found him and safeguarded him and sent him back. But then what? 3 months later, dead. Still drug dealing, albeit in London, and dead. And so bringing local authorities and others alongside to stand with you and say, right, okay, we'll receive this individual and do what we can to try and make sure that there's no reoccurrence. That, I hope, will be reinforced in the months and years to come as part of that SV duty. I mean, the other thing we can do, obviously, which more and more is to provide a greater deterrence. I mean, I know there are more and more prosecutions of the jugglers now under child grooming legislation and modern slavery. I mean, child grooming, I know Liverpool are very keen on this. Child grooming is very powerful because if they're convicted, they're imprisoned on the sex offenders wing, which even for a drug dealer is a big deterrent. There's not something that they want on their scorecard. And modern slavery, obviously, much stiffer sentences than just drug dealing. And so there's lots we can do from a deterrent point of view as well. But I think take out the unique skills of the exploiters and then really pin on a shared picture with our partners the obligation to intervene with exactly the young people you're talking about.
We welcome the surge funding for the violence reduction, and it sort of follows on from the last officer's question. But are there any plans, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, for appropriate funding for the prison service and for gang diversion organisations, which I think play a vital part in, rather than punishing, rehabilitating young people and also diverting them from the gangs that do operate in young offenders' institutions as well as outside. I don't know if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not my area of responsibility, so I have to be careful. Although the area at the MOJ I am responsible for is the revamp of integrated offender management, although it's obviously not at a youth justice end. And some of the techniques that we're using as part of IOM, I am quite keen to expand into other parts of the system. So, for example, as you might know, one of the projects we've got on at the moment is the GPS tagging of acquisitive criminals. That's up and running in 6 forces now, with some good results emerging already. We go to another 13, I think, later on this year. And it's having a huge psychological impact on the offenders themselves. One of the things we know about particularly young people who are involved in gangs and drugs is that many of them are sort of reluctant. They don't really want to be. They're terrorized into it by a smaller group of highly violent individuals who create a culture of violence and recruit them in. We do know that when young people are from time to time who are involved in that tagged, it provides a wonderful excuse not to go back to that life. It's something they can point to and say, look, I'm useless to you now, because they know where I am at all times. And we're going to be looking at some of that stuff in the future, I hope. But for the moment, the big area of focus, I think, on prisons at the moment has to be drugs. Drugs is still far too prevalent in our prison system, and I know my colleague Alex Chalk is doing a huge amount to drive that down. The other thing that I'm very keen on is data. So as you might know, as people come through the prison service, they accumulate a score about their proclivity to violence. It's not always the case that score is shared on release, so that police forces have an idea who's coming into their area. I think there's much more we can do about that as well.